As you just heard, I'm Susie Gelman, and it's my honor and privilege to be chair of the board of the Israel Policy Forum. I want to thank Gadi and the Temple Emanuel Stryker Center, as well as the many community partners who have helped to make today's symposium possible. And I also want to thank all of you for coming, because this is the kind of day that when I was in school, I would try to get the teachers to have class outside. So thank you for spending your afternoon with us. This afternoon's program reflects Israel Policy Forum's focus on security and on our commitment to be an educational resource for the American Jewish community. As an organization dedicated to preserving and advancing the goal of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we recognize that the case for two states must start with a recognition of Israel's legitimate security concerns. In this regard, we are proud to work with the Commanders for Israel Security, based in Israel, and the Center for a New American Security, based in Washington, D.C., to develop and promote resources for policymakers and community leaders that help to demonstrate that with pragmatic approaches, it is possible to enhance security, both in the short term and for the long term. We also recognize that security for Israel and for the Palestinians is impacted greatly by developments in the broader region. Today's program will address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as the ongoing crisis in Syria, the future of the Iran nuclear deal, and the opportunities for enhanced ties between Israel and the Arab world. Because many of these issues are interconnected, they will all be addressed in one way or another at every session this afternoon, regardless of the individual sessions you choose to attend. Our program will begin with a truly remarkable dialogue in our opening plenary, which I'm pleased to introduce now. In the past few years, and on just a few occasions, His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal, a member of the Saudi royal family who has served as Saudi Arabia's intelligence chief and its ambassador both to the United States and to the United Kingdom, has engaged notable Israeli figures in a public dialogue. Today is the first time he will do so in an American synagogue. Our opening plenary this afternoon will feature a conversation between Prince Turki, Ephraim Halevi, and Michelle Flournoy. A former director of the Mossad and former head of Israel's National Security Council, Ephraim Halevi is recognized for playing a critical role in the creation of the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. He continues to be an influential voice, providing challenging yet thoughtful analysis on Israel's security strategies. Michelle Flournoy is a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense, one of the most influential and highest-ranking women to have served in a national security position. Michelle is the co-founder and CEO of the Center for a New American Security and is considered by many to be a strong candidate to be appointed the first female Secretary of Defense in a future administration, inshallah. I cannot think of three more intriguing figures to hear from at this challenging time for the future of the Middle East. So let's get right to it. Let's now welcome our special guests to the stage as I turn the conversation over to IPF's Executive Director, David Halperin, who will moderate the session. And thank you again, all of you, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Gadi, Erica, the Stryker team, Adam Bassiano, and everyone from IPF for their hard work in putting today's program together. Before we get started, I want to just note that there will be opportunity for questions and answers. Cards will be provided that will be brought up to me. I will promise to try to get to as many questions that are sent up as possible, and I encourage those questions throughout today's conversation. I have the privilege, really, of moderating this, what will certainly be a fascinating dialogue with three exceptional guests. And I'd like to start with His Royal Highness, Prince Turki. As Susie mentioned, on a few occasions in the past few years, you have engaged publicly with Israeli officials. I believe the first time was in 2014 in Brussels with the former IDF official. And on very few rare occasions since then, you have engaged in public forums such as these. I wonder if you could share with the audience why. Why are you choosing to engage with Israeli officials publicly? And is this something we should expect more of from your colleagues back home?
Thank you very much. First of all, salam, shalom. And I thank the Israeli Peace Forum for giving me this opportunity to come for the first time to a synagogue. So that is an occasion that I will value, and hopefully it will not be the last time. Thank you. I have engaged with Israeli public officials. I'd just like to qualify that. They're ex-officials. As I am an ex-official. And in that context, I think it is important for all of us that we should talk to those that we disagree with, not necessarily those who are of the same mindset, especially if we have a point of view that we would like to convince the other party of. And hence, on the issue of peace in Palestine, there is a disagreement between the Arabs and the Israelis, and hence talking to the other side is valuable. And especially if they come from backgrounds like Mr. Halabi here and others of his caliber, who hopefully will still have influence and capability of getting their ideas to the official circles in the Israeli government. That is the main reason why I talk to ex-officials. Just one slight addition, I had a chance to talk once with the late President Shimon Peres when he was still President of Israel. And this was at the World Economic Forum a few years back, in which we were sitting at a dinner table across each other. And he turned to me and he said, Prince, I'd like to sit down with you, and we can do it in a very discreet way, and nobody will know about it. And I replied to him, Mr. President, nothing in Israel can be kept a secret. So if I'm going to sit down with you, it's going to be in public. And of course, that was, I think, the view that I've always taken is I will sit in public with anywhere, and if I have something to say, I will say it in public.
Thank you very much. Ephraim, perhaps I'll turn to you. Much has been made of the alignment of interests between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and many other Gulf states. In fact, I think there are elements of the current Israeli government who perceive a regional opportunity to advance peace, perhaps, as they say, an outside-in approach, regional, but for the Palestinians versus the inside-out Palestinians than regional. I'm curious what you make of this regional opportunity and how you view it from your lens.
First of all, let me say that I'm very grateful to be here with you this afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to meet such a wonderful audience as I see from this part of the hall. Let me begin by pointing out that the initiative for a outside-inside approach was not an Israeli initiative, although it is being heralded in that way today. It began in the year 2002, when the then Crown Prince Abdullah, correct me if I'm wrong, my friend Prince Turki, gave an interview to an American correspondent named Tom Friedman, who I believe is probably familiar to everybody in this hall. And in this interview, a remarkable interview, he suggested the first version of what became the Saudi Initiative for Peace in the Middle East in a public manner. At that time, I was on a trip somewhere in the Gulf, and I was approached by somebody and asked to transmit a message to the Prime Minister Sharon saying that we realize that you may not be able to accept this initiative as it is, but in order to do the right thing, don't comment on it if you don't wish to. Don't reject it. Don't reject the initiative. And indeed, I was able to pass a message to the Prime Minister, and for once he took my advice. And he did not comment and did not react immediately. I think the important thing that Prince Turki has just now said, and which I certainly second, is not only you have to talk to your adversaries, you have to listen to your adversaries. Part of what I had to do in my career was to listen to people. I also had to say things to people, but first and foremost to listen. And when I say listen to people from all walks of life, and also of all opinions, of all denominations, and of all the professions in this world, including the much-talked profession of terrorism. I think it is important to listen to professional terrorists. A, in order to understand what they're saying. B, in order to see whether there is a chink in the armor, and there usually is. And C, because by talking to people, you have the opportunity to influence them. If you don't talk to people, if you say that you don't want to talk to people, there's no way you can influence them. Yes, you can use force. Very, very, very powerful force. And I'm not a person to say that force does not need to be used on occasion, and in a very meaningful manner. But force alone is not an object on its own. It is to a purpose, and the purpose must involve dialogue. Dialogue is essential to every one of us in the Middle East. And unfortunately, we have been very, very economical with dialogue over the years. But when we did reach dialogue, we did obtain results. And therefore, it's my view that we should follow the advice of Prince Turki, and we should listen to people, talk to people. And even if there are people on the extreme side of the arc of those functioning in this very tired and very, very unpleasant region, the unpleasant neighborhood, the rough neighborhood called the Middle East. By the way, Middle East, middle of what? That is something which we should think about. I think it's a very bad denomination, the Middle East. It was, I think, created by those who said that there is the Far East and the Middle East. And what else is there? Then there's the rest of the world, because looking at it from London at the time or from Paris, you looked eastwards, so you looked to Japan, and there was something in the middle, and that was the Middle East. I think we should be trying to look at the area without using this denomination.
So I'd like to bring Michel in, but I must ask His Highness Prince Turki to respond to Mr. Halevi, particularly on the Arab Peace Initiative, and as he says, the need to engage all. Recently, of course, just a week ago, we had the reconciliation agreement between Hamas and Fatah, and I'm curious your remarks both on the viability today of the Arab Peace Initiative and the viability of this recent agreement between Hamas and Fatah.
The Arab Peace Initiative is the only viable program for peace in the Middle East because it is based on fairness. Fairness in terms of the interests of all the parties concerned. If you want to protect Israeli interests, you have to reach peace with your neighbors. If we want to protect Arab interests, we have to reach peace with our neighbor Israel. And hence, a quid pro quo in which Israel occupied lands in 1967, which would be withdrawn from by Israel, in return for diplomatic and normal relations with Israel and the cessation of hostilities. And not just by the Arab world, 22 countries, but the Muslim countries as well, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And hence, this is the deal that is on the table. Everything else on there is negotiable, whether it is on issues of the refugee return, whether it's on the issue of borders, security arrangements, and so on. Just sit on the table and negotiate these subjects with the Israelis, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that is why I say that it is the only viable program and proposal on the table, and it is on the table. It has not been withdrawn. All the Arab countries are committed to it, and hopefully Mr. Netanyahu will see it in his interest to say, yes, I will accept to talk about the peace initiative. Let us sit down at the table and we'll negotiate everything else. On the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation issue, as you know, when the break between Fatah and Hamas took place 10 years ago, it was a Saudi initiative at that time again that tried to bring them together back. And they signed a deal. Unfortunately, they did not live up to it. Since then, there have been attempts to overcome the different challenges that both sides face. The latest attempt by President Sisi of Egypt seems to have taken some traction, and they have actually not only signed the deal, but they're talking about specifics in the deal and the return of Fatah government representatives to Gaza to undertake the responsibilities of running the bureaucracy there. We live in hope, and that hope is that this deal will lead to a unified Palestinian government that can then engage in the meaningful talks with Israel to get peace throughout Palestine and not just in the West Bank. But Gaza will have to be included in that. One note on Hamas. A few years back, and perhaps Mr. Halabi can correct me on this, I remember a statement coming out of Hamas saying that while they will not recognize Israel, they will accept what the PLO, which is the Palestine Liberation Organization, will reach as a deal with Israel. And I think this has been reiterated many times by Hamas leaders. Hopefully they will stick to that as well, because we need to have all the Palestinians on board. And in order to do that, they have to be unified.
Great. I think we could have a back and forth between the two of you on this issue for quite some time, and I hope we'll be able to engage this topic a bit further in the Q&A. But I'd love to bring Michelle in to give us your take on where the United States is headed in this region broadly. We have just this past week the fall of Raqqa and the fight against ISIS. We also have the taking of Kirkuk, or the Battle of Kirkuk, between Kurdish and Iraqi fighters, of which the Americans appear to be on essentially both sides. There's a great uncertainty in terms of where the United States is headed in its direction and its goals in the Middle East. I'm curious if you can comment on that. Am I correct? Or where do you see us headed in terms of our national security goals in this region?
Well, first of all, let me say, on behalf of CNAS, I'm very proud to be co-sponsoring the event, and thank you so much for partnering with us and for all of you to spend your Sunday with us. You know, I think we don't have a great clarity on what U.S. strategy in the region is at this moment. There are some kind of enduring pillars that I think are still in place. The U.S. commitment to the bilateral relationship with Israel, the security of Israel. I think that has been unchanged across administrations and remains in place. The commitment to defeat violent extremist groups, terrorist groups like ISIS, and we've seen really the culmination of the effort in Iraq and Syria to try to deny ISIS the territory that they were claiming as a caliphate. Doesn't mean that ISIS is gone. They will now almost certainly morph back into more of a clandestine terrorist organization, but their territory has largely been taken away, at least in that immediate region. We see, I think, growing concern about Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region, its support for terrorism and proxies, its development of ballistic missile technology, its transfer of weapons to various insurgencies across the region. And we have very strong relationships with our Arab partners. So all of those pillars, I would say, are still in place. But when you ask, what is U.S. policy in Syria now? What is U.S. policy in Iraq now? How is the administration going to engage with a Russia that's returned to the Middle East? Those questions are still open. There hasn't been a lot of clarity yet about where we're going. My worry is that the U.S. has played historically an incredibly important leadership role in the Middle East, helping to bring the region together, helping to negotiate solutions, helping to maintain stability. And when the U.S. commitment is uncertain, or the strategy is unclear, or we become a factor of unpredictability, that tends to encourage bad events, the wrong kind of developments in the region to take place. So I think it's incumbent upon the administration at this moment, frankly, to clarify its position on some of these issues.
Ephraim and His Highness, I'm curious if you would give your thoughts, first Ephraim, on the state of American diplomacy in the region and leadership, and particularly the rise of Russia, and how that has impacted the regional landscape from your lens.
Well, first of all, I believe, following on to what Michel has just now said, that we can say that the American policy on the Middle East is in the process of being evolved. It's evolving and revolving and turning and twisting in the wind, and hopefully it will settle down somewhere in the stratosphere or the atmosphere and come down to earth. But what I'm trying to say is that there is obviously a very big void concerning American policy generally in the Middle East. There are bits of policy in the Middle East, like American involvement against ISIS, which is an easy one actually, because it's so clear and there are many other partners to it. But when it comes to the main issues in the Middle East, such as Syria, such as the Israel-Arab conflict, I think there has not been a clear crystallization of American policy in the Middle East. And this comes at a time when Russian policy in the Middle East has become very, very clear and very, very prominent, and unfortunately very dominant. And that is after many, many years when Russia was not active in the region, after the Yom Kippur War of '73, when the allies of the Soviet Union in the Middle East suffered their big defeat at the end of that very, very bloody war, and very, very expensive war for all the combatants. And it has taken Russia a long time to come back into the Middle East. But it's back, and it's clearly back. Does this mean to say that Russia is going to be a meddlesome factor in the Middle East alone? It's too early to say. I'd like to reveal to you that when Benjamin Netanyahu first met the Russian leadership after he first became prime minister in 1996, he told them that he thought that it was a mistake not to have involved Russia in the political evolvement of the Middle East, and that from his point of view, for instance, it was so important that Russia had been invited to the Madrid conference in 1991, which was directly after Desert War, when the United States assembled this grand coalition against Saddam Hussein. And the result of that war, which had nothing to do with the Israeli-Arab conflict, resulted in a major initiative of the United States of America to create an international platform for solving the problem between us and the Palestinians. And we met in Madrid. And it was the insistence of the United States that Russia was there. It was an insistence of the United States that President Gorbachev, who of the Soviet Union, made his last appearance as the leader of the Soviet Union. So I would say that there are elements here which could bring about maybe something, I don't want to say a joint approach of the United States and Russia to everything in the Middle East. That would be, I think, unthinkable. But elements in which there could be areas of understanding and agreement. And because of the predominant role of Russia in the Middle East and the clear aims they have in the Middle East, and the way they are going about these aims, which we can talk about if we have time, I think it would be impossible today to reach a deal, a big deal on the Middle East as the President wishes to reach, without the Russians being involved in one way or another. And this need not be necessarily in a confrontational policy towards the United States. It might be something quite different. But it would take a lot of patience, a lot of endurance, and a lot of caution.
His Highness, what do you make of U.S. policy in the region, broadly leadership in the region vis-a-vis the rise of Russia's involvement?
I grew up as a bureaucrat. I was first appointed to the Royal Court in 1973, 1 month before the start of what we call the Ramadan War. And America's leadership of the world was unquestioned and unchallenged. And throughout the subsequent years, it remained the prime mover and actor, if you like, in promoting peace in the Middle East and in its relationship with its allies, and even in countering some of the hostile attitudes towards it, particularly after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And to see America retrench, particularly during the past administration, Mr. Obama's administration, was unsettling. And I've always maintained that we need the big bear behind our backs to push us to make the tough decisions. America was the big bear all those years, accomplished much, including just as a survey of few accomplishments, Camp David Accords, the removal of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, the attempts at Camp David under President Clinton, et cetera, et cetera. And to see that this big bear is no longer behind us to push us to make the difficult decisions was, as I said, unsettling. Now, Mr. Trump has declared that he would like to have the big deal to settle the problem in the Middle East, the problem of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And he's appointed a special representative who has been traveling, etc. And hopefully they will succeed in where previous attempts have not succeeded. But we do need American participation. We do need for this big bear to be there to push us. And the clarity in policy would be very helpful in making us accede to what this policy really wants. One positive aspect of the recent announcement by Mr. Trump on the nuclear deal with Iran was, from a Saudi perspective and from my personal perspective, is that it was pretty clear. And from that respect, it is welcome that there is this clarity. Your allies in the area can work with you when the dust is cleared. But if it's foggy and murky, it's difficult to engage in any meaningful way. I'd just like to refer back to what Mr. Halabi said about Russian presence. Russia is in the Middle East, and we have to deal with Russia in the Middle East. Hopefully, and this is a reflection of Saudi Arabia's king's visit to Russia in the past couple of weeks or so, in which he is attempting to convince Mr. Putin to be on, if you like, the right side of history in Syria particularly. Russian espousal of Bashar al-Assad is counterproductive to Russian interests. Mr. Assad is the biggest terrorist in Syria. He has killed more people than Hamas or than ISIS or al-Nusra. And therefore, I think the efforts to try to convince Russia to not necessarily abandon, but to keep an arm's distance from Mr. Assad, hopefully will succeed. And if that happens, I think then we can get things moving in Syria. Just one observation on Syria and the other crisis countries in the Middle East, and I will name them. You've got Syria, you've got Lebanon, you've got Iraq, you've got Yemen, you've got Libya. All these countries have internal problems. They face what could be described as being described as failing states because they have not managed to provide a settled and stable condition for their people. And all of them suffer from this condition. Hence, they become the target for and the breeding place for the terrorist groups that have put themselves in these countries. If you look across from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon, down to Yemen, and across the sea to Libya, then you will see that the terrorists are thriving in these countries. Fix the capitals in these countries. Fix Damascus. Fix Baghdad. Fix Sana'a. Fix Tripoli. Fix Beirut. And you will get rid of the symptoms of the disease. And the symptoms are what I prefer to call fahish and not Daesh. Those of you who know Arabic will know that fahish means obscene. And
Obscene.
so that is, I think, the best way to cure the issue of terrorism in our part of the world is to have viable and workable governments that can deal with these challenges.
Michelle, I'm curious if you could respond to the idea that the United States and Russia will be able to work together effectively to create this sort of grand strategy, given that Russia's increased involvement and the challenging interests involved.
Well, I do think we have to work together to try to get to a negotiated solution in a place like Syria. And I do think Russia needs to be at the table for most of these issues because if you leave them out, they're at risk of becoming a spoiler. But I also think we should be honest about the reasons why Russia came back to the Middle East. Part of it stems from a deep sense of grievance after the end of the Cold War, that Russia was not treated well, that Russia's status as a great power was not recognized, and I think Mr. Putin, while presiding over some fairly challenging domestic economic and political circumstances in which Russians are doing worse today than they were years ago, he's turning the population's attention outward, which is very convenient for him to sort of stir up nationalism to say, I'm going to restore Russian greatness. Part of restoring Russian greatness is making Russia a global power. Part of that is reestablishing a foothold in the Middle East. Of course, strategically, he's also very interested in having a military base, military bases, and a warm water port in Syria. So I think this, he saw an opportunity in Syria, he took it, but I agree that Russia is here to stay. It's back in the region to stay, and now he's trying to reach out to Israel, to our Gulf partners and others to sort of say, wouldn't you rather rely on us than this unpredictable, unreliable United States? So I do think that's a problem. In Syria specifically, the larger problem is that our early caution in responding to the situation, and the fact that we really didn't fully support an opposition when there was a viable opposition, means that now, many years later, by focusing just on dealing with ISIS, we really haven't positioned ourselves to have leverage to influence the ultimate negotiations about the outcome in Syria. And so what we have to do now is be very clear about what are our red lines. For example, Israel. We care a lot about the security of Israel. If we're not careful and Assad comes back to power with his Russian partners and with his Iranian partners, you could have Iranian proxy forces right up on the border of Israel on the Syrian side. That should be unacceptable to us. And we should make that very clear in any negotiations. Weapons transfers, having a land bridge that goes all the way from Iran across Iraq through Syria and into Lebanon for the transfer of weapons. That should be unacceptable to us. So we are now at the point where we're going to have to negotiate kind of de minimis objectives of what, because we don't have a lot of leverage, but where will we absolutely dig in and say, this is not acceptable, we have to have a different outcome. Again, I don't see the administration focusing on that yet or articulating what those key objectives are.
Ephraim, please.
I'd like to say something about Syria a little in depth for a moment. Syria is not just a country in the Middle East. Syria has for centuries upon centuries been one of the biggest centers of Islam in the Middle East. It's one of the most ancient cities in the world. If you remember your Bible, the first city mentioned in the Bible is Damascus. The servant of Abraham, Eliezer. He was called a servant, a slave, but he was more or less, shall we say, his personal aide, call it that in modern terms. He came from Damascus. Read your Bible and you'll find out where Damascus began. Damascus was the fulcrum of Arab Islamic nationalism. And just as Mecca was the center and is the center, religious center of Islam over all the world, and Saudi Arabia is a key, a very big key and a very important player. I remember the times, my friend Prince Turki, when one of your predecessors, Kamal Adham, I see it brought a small smile to your face, used to travel monthly throughout the Arab world. And the legend had it, he had bags of money with him, and he distributed support. And his first stop was always Damascus. By the way, he once came to London, and we thought we would be able to arrange for a meeting with him and our Foreign Minister, Abba Iban, and everything was set up, but it was going to be early in the morning, and a colleague of mine was failed to wake Abu Ibn up, so he couldn't make the meeting. I'm sorry about that. Maybe history would have been different, but that's the way things are sometimes in the Middle East. People should not be asleep at the wrong time. But having said all this, ladies and gentlemen, Damascus is key. And it's not only about Islam, it's also about Arab nationalism. The first non-religious party, the Ba'ath Party, was established in Damascus. It was established by a Christian, Michel Aflaq. He was the first Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party. And I even met him once, and I don't care much to tell you where and how. But the fact of the matter is that he was a devout Christian, a Christian of very deep attachment to the Christian faith. We have to realize that Damascus is like the center, an epicenter of the globe. And if you have tremors in Damascus, as Bashar Assad once said, and for once he said the truth, if you have tremors in Damascus, the effects are felt all around the region. That is why, in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Prince Turki, there was always very, very deep attachment of the leadership in Saudi Arabia to what was happening in Damascus. And that is why it's so important that at this time in the history of the Middle East, Damascus is now the epicenter of the Iranians, of the Russians, of the Hezbollah, of the ISIS in the northeastern part of it, of the Kurds, of the Druze. All of these are factors in the equation of what is going to happen there ultimately. And we in Israel are affected by that in a very, very direct manner. I remember many years ago, we had a visit in Israel from Bob Gates, who later became Secretary of Defense, and I mentioned it to Michel that he was the Deputy Director of Intelligence of the CIA. And I took him to a visit to the Golan Heights. And we sat afterwards on the tip of the Golan Heights, looking across westwards, over the Sea of Galilee, over all the expanses of northern Israel, and in a clear day you could almost see Haifa, even the tip of the Mediterranean. And he watched and watched and watched. He turned to me, he said, "Ephraim, you can never give this up." So this, of course, is something which has to be taken into account by ourselves when we look at our future and how we judge what our priorities are. One of the things we have to do, and we'll have to do more than ever before, is to judge our priorities. And our priority is not to pursue strife and war indefinitely just in order to gain time. The time is out for gaining time. And I think now is the time to start making decisions.
And I think, if I may add to that, that when you have peace, then such geostrategic considerations like the Golan Heights and other geographic locations will no longer have the security implications that they have now. Because then, instead of becoming points of difference between the various parties involved, they can become points of confluence and points of agreement and coming together. Imagine that mountain range between Lebanon, Israel, and Syria being developed into ski resorts and water sources for the cities in that area. That is a much better proposition than having it as a military installation where tanks and aircraft and other such means of war are deployed. And hence, again, I must plug the Arab Peace Initiative, that it can, if there is sincerity in all the parties involved, be the means to achieve that kind of peace where these situations can develop. And the other thing, I think, on the consideration of Damascus, as I said, you have to fix the capitals in order to be able to deal with the symptoms that afflict these countries. Fahish and Nusra and Hezbollah and so on, they're political tools that are used to achieve political aims. They are not the substance nor the core of the makeup of the societies in our part of the world. And as Mr. Halabi said, if you look at Syria historically, it's been the gathering place for people, all kinds of people, different sects, different religions, different ethnicities. And the same in the other capitals, in Baghdad. At the height of Baghdad's glory, it was the center of the world, basically, in science, in literature, in even religious thought, and so on. And so, if you want to deal with terrorism, you have to fix the capitals. Because without that, they become breeding grounds for the terrorists.
Great. Well, I have a lot of wonderful questions that I want to get to, but there's one issue that we haven't addressed, which is the Iran nuclear deal. And Michelle, I'm curious if you could set the stage for where we're at in the next few weeks. Two of the countries that actually praised Trump's move to decertify the deal were Israel and Saudi Arabia, and I'd like to ask our two other guests to comment on that. But Michelle, what should we expect in the weeks ahead in Washington, and where do you see the future of President Obama's signature national security achievement in the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, again, here is, President Trump inherited a deal, while not perfect, had succeeded in putting a tremendous amount of time back on the nuclear clock for Iran, meaning it took them from being within weeks to months of being able to dash to a nuclear weapon, which made everybody very nervous, Israel, the Gulf states, and the United States, to a situation where we could verify that they were more than a year away from the bomb. We had very close and unprecedentedly intrusive inspections and so forth. The IAEA, the U.S. intelligence community, most of the Trump cabinet have all publicly declared that they see Iran as in compliance with the deal. But the president has talked about it being a bad deal, wanting to renounce the deal since he was a candidate. And the law requires him to certify that they're in compliance every 90 days. He's now made it clear that he's not going to do that. He's kicked the can over to Congress to say, Congress, you should do something to fix the deal. The problem is this is a multilateral deal. This was negotiated not only by the United States, but with members of the EU, with China, with Russia, and of course with Iran. This is not something that the US administration or the US Congress can unilaterally change. Furthermore, it's not, if the goal here is to put more pressure on Iran vis-a-vis its non-nuclear activities, whether it's support for terrorist groups or its ballistic missile development, the truth is this past summer, the Congress passed a very tough sanctions package vis-a-vis Iran, giving the administration all kinds of authorities to sanction the IRGC, to sanction Iran for its nefarious activities, and the administration hasn't used the authorities it already has. So yes, do we need to worry about eventually extending the deal to make it permanent? Of course. But in the meantime, we don't want to throw away the nuclear deal as we try to toughen up on Iraq. You want to try to keep the nuclear constraints in place so you don't have to worry about that dimension, while you add tougher measures, whether it's intelligence cooperation, operational cooperation, interdiction, and perhaps some additional sanctions to really push back on Iran's other activities. If this leads to an unraveling of the deal on the part of the United States, this is an own goal for those of you who watch soccer. This is an unforced, self-inflicted strategic error.
His Highness, you had been a vocal critic of the Obama administration's policy. I know that after the election, I recall you made some news saying that the Iran nuclear deal should not be scrapped entirely. Was decertification the right move?
I think if you want to put pressure on Iran, you have to use whatever means to do that. And decertification, as was described by Her Excellency, is definitely one way of putting pressure on Iran to make them live up to the not just the letter of the deal, but the spirit of it. And if I remember correctly, the signers of the deal, when they signed it, portrayed a very rosy picture of how Iran was going to turn into a very, very friendly and open and hospitable place to do business with, et cetera, which hasn't happened. On the contrary, the deal has emboldened Iran to become even more adventurous in its extraterritorial ambitions in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in various other places. They're even recruiting militias from Afghanistan and from Pakistan to go and be killed and to kill in Syria. So that, from my perspective, was the basic failure of the deal was to deal with this Iranian extraterritorial ambition. On the nuclear issue, as Her Excellency said, there is hope, at least, that during the duration of the deal, which is now next 13 years or so, Iran will not have the capability to develop nuclear weapons. But from Saudi Arabia's perspective, and I think the people of Saudi Arabia also have that perspective, not just the government, is that 13 years is even less than the blink of an eye in history. And when that date is finished, who's going to hold back Iran? And it is from that perspective that I think, that, as I mentioned in my statement that you quoted, we must make use of these 13 years now that we have in order to build on this deal, so that not just nuclear issues, but all weapons of mass destruction should be dealt with in the area in general, from the border of Iran all the way across to Mauritania on the Atlantic, including not just the Arab world, but also Israel and Turkey as well. That is what we have to do. Seek an area or a zone, if you like, where that will be free of weapons of mass destruction, that will bind all of us to that principle and not allow for developing any weapons of mass destruction, whether nuclear, biological, or chemical. And so, yes, let us make use of this interim that we have and build on it so that we'll be safe 13 years from now.
Ephraim, would you like to weigh in on the Iran deal and your thoughts?
Let me begin by saying something I repeat almost like a litany, and I'll say it here today once again. I am convinced that Israel is indestructible. I don't think that there is any way that Israel's existence is in danger as a nation and as a state. I think we have built up capabilities of various kinds in various fields. And we are able, if necessary, to defend ourselves and to preserve ourselves and to emerge, maybe with some damage, maybe with some pain, but to emerge intact. Israel is indestructible. It is one of the biggest military powers in the Middle East, and it has had not only failures, but also many successes. And I have extreme faith in the military establishment, in the defense establishment, in the intelligence establishment. And I tell you that as someone who served in the Mossad for 40 years, which is not a short period of time. I left a few years ago, and my distinct impression is that we're even less and less destructible than we ever were. So let us, for a moment, just heave a bit of a sigh of relief and not consider that there is a knife at our throats, and tomorrow morning, God forbid, Israel will no longer be there. This is not a possibility, and it is not in the cards at all.
Ephraim,
Having said that, I want to say two things. The Iran deal was not an ideal deal. There are many things that we would have liked to be included in the deal which were not included in the deal. But this was not only the result of the fact that nothing else was dealt with except the Yuguniev fact, the nuclear aspect. It was also because Israel did not wish that the negotiation with Iran and the powers should include all the items on the agenda with Iran. We believed, and this was the point we were able to make even with President Obama, that he should concentrate, and the United States should concentrate on the nuclear issue per se, and nothing else, for a variety of reasons which I don't have time to detail. So to come now after the deal and said it doesn't deal with terrorism, of course it doesn't. We didn't want it to deal with terrorism. It doesn't deal with missile production. We didn't want it to deal with missile production. We didn't want to delay the deal. We wanted it to have come as soon as possible and to be as effective as possible. And we have a time now, a time of 10, 13 years. And as Prince Turki said, this is the time to use the time in order to make sure that many of the things that we are concerned about are taken care of. Things are happening in Iran today. There are changes in Iran today. They're not as speedy as the changes in the United States of America. There's not been the kind of election you've had here. There's not been the surprises you've had here. But there are things that are happening. And look at the New York Times, which some of you probably read out of necessity every morning. And you'll see an article today about what's happening with the defense and military industry of the Republican Guards there. And I'm sure that you will respect the accuracy of the New York Times. After all, it's all the news that's fit to print, isn't it?
Ephraim, you say Israel's indestructible. We've heard warnings for years now that Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state is in jeopardy if it cannot resolve the Palestinian question. And there are more questions than ever about the viability and the future of a two-state solution. Is that an existential threat facing Israel?
I don't think that the Palestinian issue is a threat to the extent the existence of a state of Israel. But I believe that we have no option but to find a way of living with our neighbors. And in order to live with our neighbors, we have to accept them as they are. And we should not interfere in their political internal process. And if they want to have a unity, let them have unity. And if they're willing to come to us together and to negotiate with us, we should negotiate with them. And we should negotiate with terrorists. After all, negotiating with terrorists is part of the machinery of diplomacy. A few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, there was an article in your New York Times on the front page, written by a man called Jonathan Powell, who was the chief of staff of Prime Minister Blair. And if I'm not mistaken, the caption said, "When is it right to lie? When is it okay to lie? When does a political leader have not only permission, but maybe why is it a time when he has the duty to lie to his parliament and lie to his people?" And that is the case when you negotiate with terrorists. And British prime ministers over 40, 50 years lied to their public and said we have nothing to do with terrorism. Nothing whatsoever. We don't talk to them. British prime ministers used to come in the morning to the parliament and tell them again, we don't talk to them, and then rush back to write a letter to Michael McGuinness, who was running the Irish terrorist operation in Northern Ireland. So when Mr. Netanyahu says that he does not negotiate with terrorists, I hope to God he's lying.
Prince Turki, Your Highness, I have about 15 questions here, and about 13 of them are in the same theme, and that is the Arab Peace Initiative and the promotion in Saudi Arabia of peace with Israel. That is to say, at what point, what are the conditions that would be required for you or your colleagues in government in Saudi Arabia to visit Jerusalem, as Sadat once did, leading to the Israel-Egypt peace treaty? Is Saudi Arabia prepared to play a role in the solution of the Palestinian refugee challenge? And is the Arab Peace Initiative, you had mentioned it was subject to negotiation on refugees and land swaps, etc. What sort of active role can Saudi Arabia play in that process?
Well, as Mr. Halabi mentioned, it was an idea of Saudi Arabia to present the Arab Peace Initiative. And maybe Mr. Sharon was asked not to comment about it, because I'm sure everybody thought if he was going to comment, he wasn't going to be very positive about it. But I remember at that time, his chief of staff, Mr. Dov Weizklass, made the comment that the Arab Peace Initiative is the most dangerous proposition that Israel could face at that time. And that was the atmosphere, if you like, or the aroma of the response from Israeli leaders, not just at that time, but since then. It is something that the Arab Peace Initiative is something to look at. It is something perhaps one or two would say, it has some positive aspects in it. Others would say, yes, we have to modify it here and there. But none of them had the wherewithal to say, okay, let us sit down and negotiate on it. And so the kingdom has been promoting the Arab Peace Initiative since it was started, and will continue to promote the Arab Peace Initiative. So anything that needs to be done there, we will do. But we have to get an Israeli commitment on it. We simply can't talk in the air and not expect some form of feedback from the Israelis in it. I remember at a conference in Munich, Ms. Tzipi Livni was sitting in a podium like this, talking with the Palestinian representative. Mr. Indik, I think you may have been there. After they finished talking, the question and answer, I asked Ms. Tzipi Livni, I was in the audience. I said, Ms. Livni, why don't you accept the Arab Peace Initiative? She was then responsible for negotiations with the Palestinians. And she gave me a very long and very circuitous explanation about Israeli security, about Israeli threat of national existence, etc., etc. And I interrupted her. I said, Ms. Livni, all you have to do is say yes. And immediately, the immediate answer from her was, no.
But Your Highness,
that is, I think, what we are faced with. If the Israelis want more from us, they have to give us something that we can sit down with and talk.
can the Saudis do more to market the deal? It's enough. It's one thing to
I thought
present it, but it's to.
This is part of the marketing of the deal.
Thank you for that. And I will push back just a little bit further, because there are a number of questions from the audience that stress the question, why now? After all these years, you had mentioned the importance of dialogue with Israel, with Israelis in such forums. Is it Iran, especially the alliance of these interests? And from the Israeli perspective, if there are growing connections and dialogue and there is growing cooperation behind the scenes, what more does Israel get in the context of an actual agreement?
I don't think that there is any behind-the-scenes engagement with Israel. I'm not in government circles to be able to tell you yes or no on that. But I think this is a picture that Mr. Netanyahu has sort of put for himself, and that there are under-the-table understandings with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries because of the Iranian threat, etc. And this means that, we have support in the Arab world, and maybe we can reach some kind of deal without having to commit ourselves to a Palestinian resolution, etc., etc. And I think he believed that picture. Unfortunately, from my perspective, and what I have heard from Saudi officials in public and in private, what I see in the world arena and so on, there is no such under-the-table engagement between Israel and these Arab countries. What is needed is on the table, not under the table. Israel has to put its position clear to all of us, and then we can talk. And yes, Iran presents a problem for both Israel and for us. And if we're going to deal with that situation, remove the issue of Palestine from as a point of conflict. Then we can deal not just with Iran, but imagine, ladies and gentlemen, if the Arabs and the Israelis got together on scientific development in the world. Imagine if we got together on developing water resources, which is needed for both of us, medical research and accomplishments, business activities and so on. All of this is in front of us only if we can reach peace between our peoples and our governments. And we're denying ourselves that because we're sitting back and not having the peace. So please, come forward and push for this very equitable deal that is presented by the Arab Peace Initiative. And I've always said to my Jewish audiences in the past, and I will say it today, with Jewish money and Arab brains, we can go far.
Great. On that note, unfortunately, while we could go all day, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for this conversation. Thank you.